Yes, people may be very simple when they get saved. But let's look at Acts 4:13. Now, as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were marveling and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus. Although they were not educated, they were not ignorant. Every Jew had to be literate. They had to read the Torah. Not being formally educated does not necessarily mean somebody is ignorant. Okay? There are skilled tradesmen. They're not graduates, but they're good electricians, they're good plumbers, they're very clever at what they do. Doesn't mean they're ignorant. Somebody can be very uneducated, very untrained, very unlearned when they first get saved. Look what it says. The confidence. How did fishermen debate theologians about theology successfully? Because they had been with Jesus. When somebody gets saved, they may be very simple, but they don't stay that way. If you see someone who has been saved 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and they're still as simple and unlearned as they were 5, 10, 20 years ago, it's because they have not been with Jesus. They have a bubblegum faith. They may have made a profession of faith, they may have been born again, but they have never grown. The Bible is an amazing book. Biblical Christianity automatically makes people upwardly mobile. Automatically. One of the reasons evangelism is the lifeblood of the church is this. It is inevitable that no matter what council estate you came from, the moment you get saved, you're going to become much more serious in your thinking. You're going to have new priorities. Invariably, your children will be more educated than you are. Christianity makes people middle class. I'm invited to lecture in the Gypsy Bible College. Seeing people, middle-aged men and women, middle-aged, who couldn't read or write. They could all count, but read or write? From the day they get saved, they want to read the Word of God. They learn to read almost immediately. They apply themselves to it like they've never applied themselves to anything. And practically overnight, they're literate, at least functionally, and within a year, they can read as well as anyone. I once had a gypsy, he had been saved 11 months. 11 months earlier, he couldn't read or write. He devoured the Bible. Now he wanted me to get him a copy of the Mishnah. In Wolverhampton, true story. So you heard me mention it on the tape. Immediately, education increases. Again, come back to evangelism. Once you cross a class barrier, you begin to lose your capacity to relate to people of a different class. Okay? You lose your capacity to relate to those people. Therefore, you've got to get people when they're saved to begin witnessing from day one. Because in time, they and their children are going to become upwardly mobile. So you've got to keep the momentum going from day one when people are first saved, when they're in that level. Latin America, it's the same. The Gospels spread like wildfire in the barrios, in the slums. Among the poor, Africa, Asia, it's the same. But it doesn't even take one generation where you see people are more educated and it begins to have socioeconomic ramifications to their lifestyle. Somebody may be very, very simple, very uneducated when they get saved. It's more likely they'll get saved. But they don't stay that way. When you see people remaining simple, I don't mean a childlike faith, but a childlike understanding of their faith, there is something wrong with them spiritually. There is something wrong with them, and there's something wrong with the church they go to. Paul complains about this in 1 Corinthians, I keep giving you milk. I should be giving you meat by now, but I can't give you meat. You're like a baby. Says the same thing in Hebrews. You see these churches always giving baby food. People have been saved years, they're just getting baby food, if they're getting food at all. And of course, it's gotten worse in charismatic and Pentecostal circles. Being a Pentecostal, I know. It's not even food now, it's just hype artistry. A couple of verses out of context and a lot of froth to hype people up emotionally. And they confuse emotionalism and even mysticism with spirituality. Because they don't know the difference. The emotionalism and charged with a mystical influence becomes what they misinterpret as being spiritual. But of course, when the bubble breaks and they have an emotional crash, their faith goes with it. They find out that stuff doesn't work. The name it and claim it and all that, and confessing the healing, when it doesn't work, then they're in trouble. And their faith is in trouble. Turn with me, please, to the end of 2 Peter. What does the New Testament teach about education? Verse 15, and regard the patience of our Lord to be salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul also to the wisdom given him wrote you, as also in all his letters, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to understand, which the untaught and the unstable distort, as they do also the rest of the Scriptures, to their own destruction. You, therefore, beloved, knowing this beforehand, be on your guard, lest you, being carried away by the error of unprincipled men, you fall from your steadfastness. First point, Peter and Paul were both apostles. Spiritually, in his stature, because he had persecuted the church and because he was not one of the original 12, in his stature, Paul was inferior, was less than Peter. In his standing spiritually, Paul says he was less than Peter and the others. He says he was the least. He persecuted the church and he was not among the original 12. He was the least. But the book of Acts and the book of Corinthians tells us, in terms of his function, he had co-equal authority. He didn't command less authority than the 12. Okay. Peter was an uneducated man in the formal sense. Not ignorant, but uneducated. Paul was highly educated. Notice that Peter is humble enough to have no problem pointing out these things are hard to understand. Let Paul explain them. God will be able to use an educated person whose intellectual gifts and abilities have been surrendered to Christ, crucified, in ways he cannot use somebody who is not formally educated. This is not to say that Peter's stature was less than Paul's. Spiritually, no, it was higher. Paul was less than Peter, Paul says. And it's not to say that he had less authority. They had equal authority in Acts 15. But it is to say that God can use an educated person in ways he cannot use an uneducated person. Peter says that. These things are complicated. Let Paul explain it. When God needed somebody to explain the purpose of the law to the Pharisees, who did he get? A Pharisee of the Pharisees, to write Romans. When God needed somebody to stand before Caesar and Festus, who did he get? A Roman citizen who knew Latin. When God wanted to get somebody to debate the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers in Athens, who did he get? Paul, a man of great learning, the book of Acts tells us. Paul, Barnabas, and Apollos were highly educated men. Peter, James, and John were uneducated men. Matthew was sort of in the middle. Okay. Now again, nothing wrong with education. Something wrong with us. natural grounds for pride and self-sufficiency. The stronger somebody's human substance is, the more breaking they'll have to experience in their life. For the Lord to teach them to trust Him instead of what they've received. And we have nothing except what we've received. Yet we have the fact God can use an educated person who's been to the cross in a way He cannot use, or does not use, an uneducated person. He's sovereign, He can do what He wants, but that's the way He chose to do it. God's very practical, really. In this country, in Europe, the reformers were not only Roman Catholic priests, they were from the intelligentsia of the Roman Catholic priesthood. They were trained in humanist scholarship. You needed people who didn't have to rely on a Latin Vulgate, but can go back to the original Greek. People like Erasmus, people like Luther, William Tyndale. These were educated Roman Catholic clergy. Who do you get to go up against the Sanhedrin or against the Pharisees? A Pharisee. Who do you get to go up against the Roman Catholic priesthood? Roman Catholic priests. Otherwise, for all its mistakes and failures, the Reformation wouldn't have happened. You needed educated people. John Wesley was an educated man. George Whitefield was a simple man who became an educated man. Okay? Same in Old Testament Israel. Micah and Isaiah were contemporaries. We can know from the style of the Hebrew language each used that Isaiah was an educated man. Micah was relatively uneducated. Okay. Now notice, even though Paul was educated, he didn't flaunt his education. When he says, I didn't come to you with impressive speech, he was using koine. He was using ordinary dialect. He wasn't using Attic Greek like Homer or the Iliad and the Odyssey. He would communicate with people on their own levels. But just because he was able to speak to people of a working class background, he could also speak to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers on their own level. Didn't flaunt his education. Be careful of people who do that. Paul didn't do that. Yet he had it and he knew it. And he knew it. God can use people with education, providing they have taken it to the cross, in ways He cannot use others who have not been educated. There are countries that will never, ever, ever allow in an evangelist, will never open the door to a missionary. Never. Never. A dentist, a nurse, a doctor, a teacher, they'll get a visa. They'll get in.